This is a special update episode of Unholy as the ceasefire is broken and the Israeli Air Force is back in action over Gaza. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. We've been finding ourselves doing this quite often, these special updates. Only yesterday, we updated on the decision the Prime Minister made to fire the head of Shin Bet. And now, as you say, Israel has resumed the airstrikes in Gaza. The Israeli version of the story is that Hamas collapsed, is the one that decided on essentially breaking the ceasefire because it refused to free hostages. What Hamas is saying is that Israel should have begun the negotiations for stage 2 of the hostage deal and did not do that. What was on the table in the very kind of final days leading up to this development was the fact what was called the Steve Witkoff framework, meaning a release of 10 more hostages, living hostages, in return for 2 months of an extension of the ceasefire. We are at a point where, to many, it is clear that the decision made by the Israeli government and the people who support the Israeli government is that the war against Hamas should continue in one way or another. And if Hamas does not capitulate and release more hostages at this stage, what should be done is to put some sort of pressure on Hamas. Notice that we are in the level of airstrikes, not of a ground incursion. And that might, the scenario goes that what will happen in a few days is that President Trump will say to both sides, enough is enough, and let's continue on this framework of releasing the hostages. Obviously, the people who are the most concerned are the families of the hostages themselves.
Yes, of course. I mean, that's the immediate consequence alongside the death toll in Gaza. Hamas, who obviously control the health ministry and control the numbers, but as we speak, the reported number is 400, in excess of 400 casualties, 400 dead in Gaza. So these are sustained and serious airstrikes that have been lasting many, many hours. I know that Israel will want it to be one of these things where one side says that they broke and then the other side says it was down to the other. Long-time listeners know that we often turn to Amos Harel of Haaretz in these situations. He's pretty clear in the piece he's written. It says that it was Israel's government that failed to uphold the agreement. This is the one done in the last days of the Biden administration, just as the Trump administration was coming in January. Amos writes, it was Israel's government that failed to uphold the agreement when it didn't complete the promised withdrawal of IDF forces from the Gaza Strip in recent weeks, particularly from the Philadelphia route along the Gaza-Egypt border. Whether or not he now regrets it, Netanyahu had done a deal, and the deal did call for not this new arrangement that Witkoff was trying to broker, but for a second phase. After the first 42-day phase, there would be this second phase in which, as Amos writes there, Israel would withdraw and there would be negotiations about this next stage, which would culminate in a full withdrawal from Gaza and an end to the conflict and the return of all the hostages. So this is a decision by the government of Israel to break from the agreement and to resume the war. And so to the question when people ask, what is Netanyahu thinking? I think you can't really claim it's a response to events on the ground and to Hamas. It's a political choice, and I think actually quite a domestic political choice. And we will get into why that might be the motivation. But I think that the deal was the deal and it was agreed, and I'm afraid it's Israel that has broken it. Again, Amos addresses the fact that there've been appalling behavior by Hamas, particularly in those handover rituals we talked about, as Amos calls it, psychological abuse of the hostages, but they cannot be described in terms of the actual text of the agreement or the terms of the agreement. as a violation. It's Israel that didn't withdraw, and it didn't want to withdraw for all the kind of political reasons we'll get into.
Well, we should say, first of all, that the actual agreement was never released to the Israeli public, but the parts of it that were talked about the fact that after 16 days, a negotiation should begin about regarding the second phase of the deal, and that somewhere between the 42nd day and the 50th day, Israel should withdraw its forces from the Philadelphia corridor. That indeed did not happen. And what we should say, and you mentioned the sort of domestic politics at play here, we should mention that Netanyahu's big test this month is the budget that needs to pass. For that, if that happens, his government can survive for at least, I would say, until June of 2026, because the main way to take Israel to elections to dissolve the Knesset would be if the budget does not pass in the Knesset. You already see the fact that after these airstrikes resumed, the person coming back or intending to come back to the coalition is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who I remind you left the coalition over the argument in the first phase of this hostage deal. So it does seem like Netanyahu has his coalition coalesced around him, but there is the X factor, and this continues throughout this story. Donald Trump, will he let this, run its course for a few days and then say enough is enough? Or will it let, Netanyahu do what he wants to do? Politically, it is a more comfortable position for him to be at. And of course, what he is saying to the Israeli public is we are putting the pressure on Hamas to release more hostages. In the public eye, it is a very big deal because most of the Israeli public wants to see the release of the hostages. One note to be made, we recorded a whole update episode about Netanyahu's intent to fire Ronen Bar. He is not yet fired. He is completely in these classified meetings and helping with the planning and with the information. This is sort of an interesting the Israeli situation in which the prime minister 2 days ago said that he has no confidence in the head of the internal security service, Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, and now he is still there inside in the midst of these deliberations.
Yeah, it reminds me of that period when Yoav Gallant was officially fired and yet was still coming to work every day as defense minister. It was this weird in-between state. I think the point about the politics is right, the distinction you make between the coalition and the country. For the coalition, this makes sense for him. He can now bring Ben-Gvir back in, as you said, gives him better numbers, bigger numbers for passing that budget, but also just for keeping his seat, the seat which is all important, as we've been saying for so long on the podcast. That is the trillion-dollar question for Netanyahu, because it's what keeps him out of jail if given those corruption cases against him. So that is the number one starting point with all this. He needs to be in the prime minister's chair. And when there was a ceasefire deal that threatened to break up his coalition on the table or in the air, that made it a problem. When the country's at war, that's fine for Ben-Gvir, fine for the far-right partners, they can stay. In terms of the country, polling in February showed that Israel supports completion of this second phase, the one that hasn't happened, of the ceasefire, including IDF withdrawal. I'm looking at the poll numbers now by a margin of 3-1. 68% of Israelis support a deal that would end the war and release all the hostages. So it's an odd kind of politics where for domestic political reasons you do what 3/4 of your country, or nearly, do not want you to do because some far-right coalition partners prefer war to a pause in fighting, and they are prepared, and let's just call it straight, to abandon the hostages to their fate. And another point I would make about these airstrikes is we know that Israeli intelligence does not have real-time, reliable knowledge of where the hostages are. They could be under fire right now. We know also from what hostages have said when they've come out that was among the most terrifying moments for them were when they were under airstrikes, when the Israeli Air Force was striking Gaza. Those bombs don't know who they're hitting. And so those hostages, I think it's 59, I think is the figure, are vulnerable. And so even if, you are unmoved by the notion of 400 Palestinians dead in Gaza today, and your number one and sole concern is the hostages release, even then, surely you have to be furious with Netanyahu for doing this, because it's not as if it had come to this point or was forced. Instead, this is an active political choice. You mentioned the Americans. You're quite right that Trump was threatening all the time Hamas if they didn't release all of them. There'll be hell to pay, hell on earth, and so on. What we now, of course, understand is that was never going to be delivered by American forces. What he meant was, I will give a green light to Netanyahu to do what he wants to do. And so we're seeing some of that. The other American element is this strike by the Americans recently on the Houthis in Yemen, and a rhetoric from Donald Trump suggesting that the focus was not, was not solely on the Houthis, but the sort of end destination was Iran, the Houthis' backers. And therefore, there's a sort of sense that in Washington of impatience with the proxies, whether that be the Houthis in Yemen or Hamas in Gaza, a kind of gloves-off attitude to Iran's proxy forces. But I think a very, very depressing day for those people in Gaza and for those people caring about the return of the hostages.
I think the fact that you mentioned the Houthis in Yemen is important, because I remind you when we had a conversation with General David Petraeus in an episode we called The General's Plan, he said that his critique of the Biden administration was saying you should have been more forceful against the Houthis. So Donald Trump is picking up that. But the response will probably be another return of Houthi rockets over Israel. That stopped during the ceasefire. And I remind you that the Houthis kind of took on themselves the Palestinian issue, let's be more accurate, the Hamas issue, and said that as long as there is a ceasefire, they won't shoot over at Israel. They can still do that, and they can return to doing that. So we might see that as well in the next couple of days. We have been meeting a lot for an update episode. We might meet again tomorrow, but we shall say that our next scheduled episode, at least on paper, will be on Friday.
See you then.